All right. I'll tell everyone now.
How's that feeling? Good? Yeah?
And the percussion player.
Okay. Can we try something with everyone?
بنت الشلبية عيونها لوزية بحبك من قلبي يا قلبي وانتي عينيا كسر الخواطر يا ولفي ما هان عليا تطل وتروح والقلب مجروح ايام عالبال بتعن وبتروح ايام عالبال بتعن وبتروح
Hi, everyone. I am Carolina Doe, the Community Engagement Associate at Playco. Please excuse my internet. I'm on Spectrum, so this might be glitchy, but everyone else on the panel will not be glitchy. Um, for those of you who are new to Playco, Playco is currently in its 20th season, and it commissions, develops, and produces new plays from the US, around the world, to create contemporary theater that reflects and responds to both our New York City home and today's interconnected world. The Play Company is based in New York City, our office in Manhattan, as well as the rehearsal, performance, and other spaces where we work in New York City are located on the Lenape-Hoking homeland of the Lenape people. Lenape-Hoking is the Lenape name for Lenape land, which spans western Connecticut to eastern Pennsylvania and the Hudson Valley to Delaware, with Manhattan at the center. We recognize that this land was forcibly taken and sovereignty was never ceded. We acknowledge the genocide and displacement of indigenous peoples. The Lenape diaspora is dispersed throughout Canada, the US, and includes 5 recognized nations in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario. We honor the past, present, and future generations of the Lenape and all Indigenous people who have stewarded the land, water, and air we occupy. We call upon the people who inhabit Lenape-Hoking today to join us in learning this history and celebrating the present Lenape community and becoming better stewards of Earth. We also acknowledge the African people who were enslaved and whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country. We recognize that this public acknowledgement is only one step in the ongoing process of honoring and supporting these communities. This roundtable discussion, entitled Story as Resistance, the Joys, the Heartbreak, and the Food, is a part of our ongoing Idea Lab series, which complements our productions with an eclectic series of free public conversations, events, and activities with artists and scholars and community leaders. All events are free and open to the public, and in this current pandemic, live to your homes. Without further ado, I am very, very excited to introduce to you all Catherine Correa, our moderator.
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Carolina. First of all, I want to begin by congratulating Play Company Woolly Mammoth for This Is Who I Am. It is, if you haven't seen it yet, a beautiful, beautiful show. So congratulations to Amir Nazar Zawabi, Evren Achikin, Ramzi Fargala, and Yusuf Sultani. Just gorgeous work. And I hope that if you haven't seen it, that you are able to tune in before the closing, which I believe is January 3rd. I was pretty inspired by the title of this roundtable conversation and immediately knew with whom I wanted to be in conversation. And if you could bring everybody into the room, I will introduce everybody one by one by way of telling you a little bit about their work. First, I want to introduce Jamil Khoury, who is the co-founder and co-executive director, artistic director of Silk Road Rising, an art making and art service organization that shapes conversations about Asian, Middle Eastern, and Muslim Americans. A theater producer, playwright, essayist, and filmmaker, Khoury's work focuses on Middle Eastern themes and questions of diaspora. He's particularly interested in the intersections of culture, national identity, religion, and belonging. Wonderful. Lamis Isak is an actor, writer, and the founding artistic director of the Obie-winning company Noor Theater, dedicated to the work of theater artists of Middle Eastern descent. Lamis has appeared in several regional and off-Broadway theater productions, including The Fever Chart and Stuff Happens, at the Public Theater, The Black Guide at New York Theater Workshop, and Noura at the Old Globe Theater. Her full-length play, Food and Fadwa, co-authored with Jacob Cater, premiered off-Broadway at New York Theater Workshop in 2011, and we'll get to that in a moment. I want to hear all about it. Noura Al-Samahi was born in Tripoli, Libya, and raised in Cairo, Egypt. She has appeared in productions at many theaters, including Alter Theater, Aurora Theater, Crowded Fire, Magic Theater, Fool's Fury, and so many. The San Francisco Shakespeare Festival, African American Shakespeare Company. And in 2018, she performed in kitchens all over the Bay Area in Golden Thread's production of Oh My Sweet Land by Amir Nazar Zawabi. We look forward to hearing about that too. Piron Yusufzada is a director, writer, co-founder of Maya Directors, and the Associate Artistic Director and Director of Engagement at Jiva Theater Center. She has a passion for new work that centers and uplifts the stories of the local majority communities and has developed and directed work extensively, regionally and in New York City. She's currently developing new works with writers Sanaz Tusi, Ramiz Monsaf, and Nikki Masood. Perron is a usual suspect at New York Theater Workshop, a New George's affiliate artist, a member of Ensemble Studio Theater, Wing Space, and the Drama League Directors Council. Perron Yusufzada. Hannah Khalil, a writer of Palestinian Irish heritage, was the recipient of the Arab British Center's Award for Culture in 2017. Her stage plays include a museum in Baghdad, which ran at the Swan Theater at the Royal Shakespeare Company in 2019-2020, and it marked the first play by a woman of Arab heritage at the RSC. She is currently developing an original television series with Netflix Arabic, and Hannah is also the co-founder of Manara Festival in London, which I hope she'll tell us about. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us. Really appreciate it. You know, we've been in touch, and given the theme of this roundtable conversation, not to mention the play at the center of these conversations, I'm just wondering if anybody has a story, a tidbit, an anecdote that came to mind when you heard the title of this conversation, which is Story as Resistance, the Joys, the Heartbreak, and the Food, something you may have experienced in your personal or creative work, your life, or something that you witnessed. Anybody want to jump in? Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. How about this? Okay. I'm wondering how the themes of this roundtable have been part of your creative work. So I guess the first person that I want to hear from is Lamise, because you wrote a play that could not fit more perfectly in the themes of this conversation. I'll tell you that the play Food and Fadwa, which premiered at the New York Theater Workshop, and which I saw several times because I love it. I'll tell you this much, okay? Just by way of introducing it, Lamise. As the play begins, Fadwa Faranesh prepares for her younger sister Dalal's wedding to Amir and awaits the arrival of Amir's brother Yusuf, her former lover, all while dealing with the diminishing health of her father, Zain Faranesh, the patriarch of the family. Fadwa was a talented cook, the pillar of the family. And as the family contends with Israeli occupation, interrupting the normalcy of their daily lives, Fadwa often imagines she is the host of a television cooking show, whimsically explaining the culinary delights of her culture. Tensions are heightened when the family is forced into a 24-hour curfew by the Israeli Defense Force. And as the family tries to sustain itself over several days in the house, the struggle between wanting to maintain culture and stability and embrace a more hopeful life in a new world looms large inside the house. Lamise, tell us about the origins of Food and Fadwa.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Thank you for your wonderful invitation. Thank you for having me on this panel. Just 2004. I was trying to make some career choices. I wasn't quite sure which direction I was floating in, but I was very much interested in cooking, and for a while entertained leaving acting, and I hadn't yet started really writing in earnest for a life in the kitchen. And I was not really employed, and I was watching I was sleeping on someone's futon, and watching a lot of Food Network, and there was something, I think it was back before they, you had all these competitions and stuff, but Food Network wanted to find the next Food Network star. So I was like, well, And you had to sort of pitch something to them by creating a video. And I just been a part of the Arab American Comedy Festival, which is a really fun festival in New York. Still going on, but at the time there were like sketches, and so I met this very robust community of actors, directors, writers, and comics. And I met a gentleman named Jacob Taylor who was in film school at the time. And I was like, hey, will you help me film this thing? I'm gonna like pitch a children's show. And he's like, sure. And so he filmed me in the kitchen with the kid making some kind of brown. And we started riffing on the idea of how funny it would be if we just kind of created a maybe miserable cooking show, sad and angry cooking shows. We sort of was riffing during takes and stuff. And we thought that we could write something funny for the comedy festival for the following year. I did not get the show. I didn't get picked by the Food Network. So, but we went on to write this play, and he sort of had this idea. He's like, well, what if she's just pretending to have her own cooking show? And that sort of brought up how someone may cope, inside a very difficult situation. So we placed her, because we're both Palestinian, and we placed her in the West Bank and in occupied West Bank around the time where there were a lot of incursions. I mean, there still are. And I had just been to I just spent 3 months in Palestine with my family sort of prior to this. And these women, they are just these sort of designated, cooks of their families. And, like my uncle's wife would wake up every morning and start making dinner. I mean, like breakfast was already done at 7, 8 a.m. She was making, ghada and then dinner, lunch and dinner. And this was every single day. There wasn't like a leftover day or a pizza day. There was every single day. And it's labor intensive cooking. This isn't some, what I do, which is like steam some kale. This is like, takes 2 days, 3 days to make something. And I just, we wanted to sort of incorporate that, how at some level that can break down your identity in a way. You don't really live out maybe the things that you wanted to live out in favor of maybe taking care of a family in this very particular way that they can do. But also we wanted to talk about the occupation in a way at the time, and this was 16 years ago, and by the time we did it was 2012, so 8 years ago now. We might do something very different today in the way we approach things. You don't see a lot of Palestinians on stage at the time, especially focusing on something like this, at least not in New York and not in the US. So we wanted to present the occupation in a way that felt accessible. So our access points were through food. And the sort of pretending to have a cooking show sort of created this sort of dramatic, comedic sort of vibes for people to kind of be like, okay, this character is confiding in the audience about how annoying her family is, especially once they get stuck in house arrest. And there's a curfew, and they're just like, what? And also we were really interested in what happens to people when and we're experiencing it now in quarantine, which is really interesting to talk about. So these ideas of what happens when you're forced to be together with your family members. And in this case, if you leave, you risk being shot. And maybe we have a very sick patriarch who needs medicine and we can't get them medicine, and then they're running out of food. So how you manage all of that kind of external stress, and then the internal stress of not getting along with a cousin, or, we created a little love triangle, drama triangle within it, sort of soap opera style that sort of made it a little bit fun and a little bit fun to explore there. But also the father sort of declines during the length of the play. So that sort of Fadwa's ability to care for him with the only thing she knows, which is through food, also, she starts to lose her power to be able to do that. So that's the very, I guess, the lengthy story of the origin and sort of the themes of it and the things we wanted to explore. But I think food is such a wonderful access point for everybody. We all have our stories around it. And it's also, you know, the neurology, the sort of the neurological sort of aspect of it. You smell something, it takes you to a memory. You know, it's very, very powerful. So.
Yes. And I remember that the first time I was exposed to the material was just simply the monologues. It was during Aswat. And I didn't even know it was turning into a full-length play at that point. And all I heard were these monologues that put me in my grandmother's kitchen, boom, but also taught me about the occupation. That's what grabbed me about the whole thing, the connection between Fadwa's sense of responsibility, her passion for cooking, her creativity, but in a situation that was untenable. So that's really interesting that also you compared it to the current situation, because everybody's cooking a lot these days. Definitely, absolutely. Speaking of cooking, on stage, which for you, Nora, were kitchens all over San Francisco, doing Amir's play, Oh My Sweet Land, which I know very well. Can you tell us what that was like? Being in a different kitchen for every show and having that audience there smelling what you were cooking. What were you making, by the way? Were you making kibbeh?
I was making kibbeh, but luckily no one had to eat it. So that was the saving grace. Yeah, I mean, just having the task of doing and then telling the story was actually very comforting. I have one of my best friends I've very many cook friends. I feel like a lot of people who are in theater do because of our schedules. So I did a lot of skill sets with him, like literally how to cut an onion and just deal with waste. But aside from that, the changing environments were, for me, it felt like working with a live actor on stage. It's like the small shifts were enough that kept it interesting. And there were some days where the audience would literally be 3 feet away from me, and some where they would be 8 feet and then so wide, so my range had to change so much. The most gratifying experience was I did at Glide, which is a church here in San Francisco that serves the homeless population, the local homeless population. And that for me was just such a gift, because people would literally come in and out the entire performance. I mean, leave to get something, close the doors, come in halfway with a walker, and then walk back out. But I love that stuff on stage. And I prefer those environments than actually a quiet theater, because it reminds me a lot of theater in Egypt, where people are eating chips and maybe talking to the person next to them. They don't like it, they like it. You have a sense that the people are truly engaged with what you're doing, as opposed to feeling like they have to behave a particular way. And the first performance I did at Glide was right during a very bad fire we had here in October of 2018. And just the conversations that ensued afterwards with the audience were just incredibly rich, mostly about not being forgotten as humans for a lot of these people that lived in the neighborhood, and relating to what was going on, of being displaced. And so just the echoes of connection through food. And then one woman who told me she'd lived in Lebanon for years. And yeah, anyway, just a beautiful, beautiful experience. And I got very good at chopping onions. And although my favorite story is my brother did come to watch one of the shows, and at the end of the show, he leaned over to my friend. He's like, all that cooking for an hour, she comes out with one kibbeh, just one kibbeh. So, and then after that, what we did is we actually were able to engage with this Syrian family that catered the event. So after each show, we would gather and eat, and then people would share stories. It's one of those shows that after you do, I felt like, I'm done. But then I did 9 Parts of Desire afterwards, so kind of tried. But anyway, it was such a gratifying experience.
Nora, I'd love to touch on, I didn't give the background of the play. Can you just briefly tell us, for the sake of people who didn't see Oh My Sweet Land or don't know it, basically what this woman is, the story she's telling?
Oh, it's such a beautiful story, because she's half German, half Syrian. and she meets this man in Paris. She's intrigued by this man that she keeps seeing because she, as the Syrian war starts, she feels she wants to connect with Syrians, even though she's, which I can very much relate to, being a half-halfy person. You're sort of on the periphery of all worlds, right? And when you feel you really want to connect into a world, you just sort of spin around it and try to find your place. So she keeps going to this cafe, and she meets this man, and he starts telling her his story. And so throughout the show, she's the narrator, but she's telling the story of this man and then all the characters he meets. So it's really, for me, I felt like I was sitting with a friend telling the story that becomes a love story, but so much more than that. It's her search of identity, and then it's just beautiful. It's such a beautiful piece. I miss it. I miss it.
Yeah. I love the piece. I just love it. Yeah. Thank you, Nora. Absolutely.
Thank you, Brad.
Yeah. And Jamil, so I'm quoting you now because from your bio, because of your passion for the intersections of culture, national identity, religion, and belonging, which, immediately brings up for me, heartbreak and food. I'm just going there right away. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about your feelings about where those things come together, and maybe even tell us one of your experiences of examining those aspects of existence?
Well, I think I'm examining those aspects on a daily basis. I think that, the question of culture being of a mixed heritage, Syrian and Polish Slovak on my mother's side, Syrian on my father's side. The question of Americanness and what does it mean to be American in the 21st century? What does it mean to be American today? Because I am not sure. A complicated relationship that I have with a church community that I love, but I don't know that they necessarily love me. And the question of belonging and how we create community and how we forge relationships and connections and like-mindedness. So I think food is probably always there. It always is living somewhere. I think back to childhood. I used to, my father was really the primary cook at home, although my mom's a good cook too. And I just remember nobody knew what hummus was. It was, growing up in a suburb of Chicago, it was like this exotic thing that you could get at Jamil's house. And now, of course, you can't walk into, a 7-Eleven or I don't know where, and not see any varieties of hummus. I do think a lot about the idea of connectedness with culture, with heritage, with family through food, and particularly the Syrian food and the Polish food. And I'm going to say something in a moment that at the risk of offending like everyone on this panel. So I love the Levantine and Slavic foods. They are comfort foods. They make us feel good. I'm married into South Asian culture, and their food is art. Their food goes to a whole other level. And every time I've told Malik just that, he doesn't contest it. So I think that the idea of having multiple cuisines in our lives is something exciting and enriching, and is also a way that people can get to know each other. So, those questions that are sort of my obsessions are, part and parcel to this whole idea that we are fluid and we are flexible and we are evolving and we change and we adapt, and our cultures meet each other, and in that meeting something happens, and that something can be extraordinary, it can be off-putting, it can be anything in between, but that is what excites me ultimately, is interchange, and then that process of discovery and learning and transformation. And of course, if there's a good meal to go with that, all the better.
You know, you read my mind, because right before you started talking about South Asian cuisine, I was going to say to you, okay, you're married to somebody from another culture, maybe not worlds away from Syria, but a different culture, a different cuisine, which I completely agree is an art form. There's no question about it. And I'm just wondering what kind of conversations have evolved either at home or at the theater, at Silk Road, that, you know, have come out of, you know, because it's Silk Road. You're all over the Silk Road, right? So people from whose origins are in many different parts of the other side of the world come to you and meet as at Silk Road. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, I'm really glad you bring that up, because people who have worked at Silk Road will oftentimes refer to the presence of food or the abundance of food. And certainly that we, you know, in addition to providing food or bringing food, we encourage people to also share food. And that has been something really extraordinary. When we take these trade routes that stretched, you know, China to Syria, Japan to Italy, if you include the sea routes, that's a lot of food. And the fact that, you know, over the years, we've all been exposed to these amazing, you know, Filipino dishes and Chinese, and of course, you know, South Asian and Iranian and Arab, and, you know, the sort of the expanse of the Silk Road. Forgive me who I'm forgetting. I think that has been a way, that is dramaturgy in many respects. You know, that is an entry point into so many of the cultures that we're exploring and that we're grappling with. And I also think that it is a way of disarming people and helping people work through whatever strange perceptions or fears or, you know, hangups they may have. So, you know, I think back to a mosque community in West suburban Chicago that we have done some work with, and how they realize, and it's primarily in Arab and South Asian, some people of Balkan heritage, some African Muslims, and how they have really used food in their outreach to the immediate community, particularly when there was a lot of resistance to them even building in the first place. And, you know, inviting neighbors and inviting, you know, Christian communities and Jewish communities and so forth into the mosque building to have Pakistani food or Egyptian food or, you know, fill in the blank, has gone a long way. It is culinary diplomacy, and it has worked for them. So, you know, I think that these are assets. This is another thing I think a lot about is like cultural assets and heritage assets. And, you know, how do we leverage that? How do we position that to reach people and to, you know, have some kind of meaningful impact?
Beautiful, beautiful. Oh, shoot. Here I am. Yes. Beautiful, Jamil. Thank you so much. And that actually brings up for me just a quick personal story, which is that, like many of us, I am derived from two very, very different cultures, Irish and Lebanese. And my, you know, there was a certain amount of tension in my grandmother's house about that. And all I can say is that when the food came out, because she was a great cook, she wasn't a particularly nice person, but she was a really, really wonderful cook. And when she covered the table with what she made, we were in awe, and it basically stopped all conflict, okay? It wasn't just that we were only stuffing our faces. We were also telling her how wonderful she was, and this was so good, and this is that, and my mother tasted hummus, and that was a big deal. It was a whole thing. And, you know, I'm just saying that those, what's the word, diplomacies, food as dramaturgy, as you said, that can work in a personal circumstance as well as a larger community context. Perone, I'm so curious about all that you're doing, but at the moment, I'm thinking about your role at Jiva as director of engagement, right? I'm really curious what that means in terms of the potential for cross-cultural dialogue, cross-cultural food, whatever, conversation. Can you talk a little about that role?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And it's just such a pleasure to be in such wonderful company this afternoon. The engagement department at Jiva Theater Center actually started with my hiring. It did not exist before I arrived. And so it's, we're a couple years in, but of course, about 9 months of that time has been spent in quarantine and a global pandemic. So, how those efforts have shifted, in a lot of ways, just because of the parameters of what we can and cannot do. But I think that it's so connected to so many of the things that my colleagues here have already talked about in terms of I think centering communities in their own stories. And I think Jamil was speaking so beautifully to culinary diplomacy, which is a phrase that I'm going to steal and apply to everything going forward. But that there's something about how, I think about when I saw Food and Fadwa and when I watched This Is Who I Am, that there's a way in which the food is both universal and also singular and centers a community in that singularity. And so if someone is unfamiliar with that cuisine, that you're aware of that the whole time, and that's okay, that it's okay to be unfamiliar with something. And I think sort of similarly about engagement work and about engagement programming, that we're building trust, we're building relationships that need to be long-term, that need to be transformative and not transactional. And that to do that, we can't impose a predominantly white dramaturgy or a predominantly white aesthetic onto a community's specific story or experience. But that we have to allow those perspectives to lead us if we are actually going to decolonize our regional theaters. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because of just how I've been in spaces where I've seen how Manasa work can sort of, there can be feedback, dramaturgical feedback that's actually born of just cultural ignorance. And it's not, like, the note doesn't apply, because in the same way that, like, I'm not going to give the note, like, why isn't this white family taking their shoes off when they get inside? Like, that's not them, that's us, And so, so I think that there's a lot of work to do around distinguishing between what a play needs and what we project onto the play, or what a predominantly white aesthetic projects onto a play. And I think engagement work is very much about centering the community whose story is being told, and really, like, sort of dismantling those dramaturgical expectations of whiteness that I think can, like, whitewash and dilute and diminish that singularity in the work.
I keep getting muted. I'm responding, but Piron, you said that the role of director of engagement originated with your hire, and I'm wondering, was that your idea? I'm just curious. How did that come about? Is that telling tales, or can we know?
I mean, I think we can talk about it. Well, so I mean, I'm both the associate artistic director and the director of engagement. And so what happened was I was freelancing at Jiva I came to the realization that I wanted to be an artistic leader, and that the reason I had mostly ignored that option was because I'd never seen, coming of age. Now, of course, like I know Lamis and Tourange and, and Jamil, but like coming of age, I'd never seen like an artistic director who looked like me and had a name as difficult to spell as mine. And so when I realized like that I had sort of denied myself an ambition because I didn't think it was possible, I approached Mark Cuddy, the artistic director at Jiva, and said, like, why don't I was full of moxie this day. To this day, I don't know what came over me to go into his office and say, like, you don't have an associate artistic director. You should have an associate artistic director, and it should be me. I just, a white man took over my body and just like filled me with confidence. But so I said that, and he said, well, we're actually trying to hire a director of engagement. And I said, great, it's the same job. Because I do feel that, at the end of the day, when we talk about like, how are we going to find new audiences and like, what are we going to do about the dying audiences of the regional theater, that artistic leadership is civic engagement, and that anti-racism is like the creation of the culture of abundance that our regional theaters need. And that like all of these things I think are values that some people perceive to be at loggerheads with one another are actually very much in concert with one another. So anyway, it came from a day of moxie and good timing and a strong relationship. That's how it happened.
It was meant to be. What can I say? It was meant to be. Hannah, my darling, in London, there you are. And I just, okay, couple things. First of all, like many of us and a few of us right here today, you are coming from two different cultures, and they're really different from each other. I can relate, okay? Because the differences are probably familiar to me. And I'm wondering, culturally growing up, I don't know what your circumstances were, where you lived or anything, but I'm curious about where and how the culture of your home evolved into you, basically, in terms of, how you spent your time, what you cooked, what you ate, what you love, and how that might play into your writing. I'm really interested.
Sure. So, hello, everyone. Massive honor to be part of this incredible group of people. I feel very privileged. So thank you for asking me, Catherine, and for the Play Company for asking me. My mum's Irish, my dad's Palestinian, and I grew up in Dubai, actually. My dad ran hotels. So I grew up in Dubai in the Middle East as a kid. So we ate a lot of Arabic food. I was a very picky eater. There's a great story about going to visit my city in Palestine, and they all called me Asfura, which means little bird, because I ate so little, apparently. And my granny made this amazing breakfast, and everyone sat down to breakfast and started eating, and it was very early, and they were eating hummus with meat and bread and eggs and halloumi. And I couldn't eat any of those things at that time of the morning. And my grandmother noticed, and of course it's slightly complicated because I don't speak Arabic, so I wasn't able to communicate with her directly, but she noticed that I wasn't eating anything, and she disappeared to the kitchen, and she reappeared with a massive pot of bamia, which is like okra stew with lamb in it, because she knows that's my favorite. And she just thought, oh, well, she can have this for breakfast because she needs to have something for breakfast, and clearly it's just she doesn't like this stuff, which obviously wasn't the case. And my dad just looked at me and went, you have to eat it now. So but yeah, so Palestinian food very much a part of my culture growing up, and actually really important because my dad never really talked to me about politics or about the history of Palestine. I had a lot of anecdotal stories about his experience and my family, and how they lived, and having been there, of course. But he never talked to me about politics. And he never spoke to me in Arabic, which is why I don't speak Arabic. And I spent many years being a bit confused about that and not really understanding it. And I think now I understand that it was about trying to make me not Arabic because he thought I would have a better chance if I was hiding in plain sight, which is kind of sad, isn't it? But and ironic, because basically I hit my 20s and started going, I want to know more. Like, I know all about the food. Of course, I know all about the food and I can cook the food, but I want to know a little bit more about the history. And and I also always in this awkward position of being asked to speak for Palestine. I'm sure the rest of the people on the panel have this too. Like, just being asked, so what, what's your take on what's happening? And it's two-state solution. What do you think? And just not really knowing what I thought. So I thought, well, I better find out. So started going to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is an amazing place that has a brilliant Palestinian society that does loads of events. And it was through going there that I basically armed myself with knowledge about my history and my heritage and started writing plays about Palestine, which is something I avoided doing for a very long time because it was terrifying to feel like a spokesperson for Palestine. I didn't feel like I had the right to do that, and so that's how I started writing plays about Palestine, and that's how I came to kind of that's my so I moved to the UK as a teenager when my parents got divorced, and ironically my Irish mother, the only thing she cooks one Irish dish, which is bacon and cabbage, but other than that she cooks Palestinian food all the time. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Catherine.
That was lovely and so personally meaningful to me for a number of different reasons. And I also I'm reminded too about the choices that parents make, such as your father's, of not speaking Arabic with you. The same thing happened to me, but for maybe slightly different reasons, which had to do with my mother not speaking Arabic and his not wanting to alienate her because my grandmother was trying very hard to alienate her. And so, so in a way it became a weird kind of, not a weapon, but in her case it was a weapon because she would speak Arabic to exclude my mother and my father would answer her in English. So there you go. Nora, I wanted to come back to you because Hannah and Jamil and I are American and or British, derived from two different cultures. But girl, you literally grew up in Cairo, and now you're in the US and you have a professional life in the United States. And my question is, do they just dovetail beautifully, or?
On a good day. I mean, Hannah's story is all of your stories. My mother's actually American, Caucasian, raised in Wilmington, Delaware, born and raised. My parents met when my father was a graduate student at the University of Delaware. They're with me right now, and my father just turned 85. So they've been together for 60 years. And then my mother moved to Egypt in 1964. My mother is amazing. She spoke no Arabic, not a word. Now she just, and she also has absolutely no fear. So she just talks and talks and talks. Gender mistakes, it doesn't matter. She'll keep talking. So I was raised by these two people. So I was raised in a very cross-cultural home. Hannah, when you speak about being very picky, I was a terribly picky eater. And my grandmother would do the same thing. She would constantly bring out, like, maybe try this now, maybe try this now. But I spent years eating honey and aish baladi. But, and I went to an American school in Cairo. So I speak Arabic, but I'm not a native speaker because I wasn't educated in Arabic. So it's this, talk about confusing. I mean, this is the case with a lot of friends of mine who are half-halfies, and we have very strong spoken Arabic, but if you ask us to give a speech in Arabic, we're like, no, thank you, I'll do that in English. So there's that, but I feel very connected to my Egyptian, and I never thought I would stay here, to be honest with you. I mean, I thought like a lot of Egyptian kids or Arab kids, I thought I would become a doctor. My father still tells me I would have made a good doctor. I mean, literally, he just told me the other day I would have made a good doctor. I'm like 46 years old, I'm not becoming a doctor. But So I thought I would. So I thought I would be in the U.S. for 8 to 10 years, and I would go back because I fancied myself a strong activist at the age of 17, you know. And it turns out my activism is much quieter and it's on stage. But I moved to the Bay Area right after college. And then I thought I would be here for 4 years, and it's like 24. But I had never been anywhere like the Bay before. I found the East Coast to be challenging culturally, to be honest with you. From the cold to also, these are the ways I didn't realize how culturally Arab I am, or Egyptian I am, which I was very friendly and would engage in conversation with all people. And then people thought I don't know, and I would ask about people's families. That was a big thing. Like if I asked you about your family, then it became too personal, I realized. So it was just very, very interesting. The things you think of when you're this very westernized kid growing up in Egypt, and then you move to the US and you realize, oh, I'm actually not as Western as I thought, because I never lived in the US. So yeah, I mean, like you said, Hannah, like I was asked, I remember when I moved here for college, like, so what's the situation with women in Egypt? I'm like, what the, are you asking me this question about all the women of Egypt? But I found my home in places like Golden Thread, in the community, in the theater community. And I think about one of the first plays I was ever in, this years ago, but I was with this good friend of mine named Bella Warda, and she, like, day 2, she would keep coming in with food, like, you know, dates and nuts, and she's Iranian. And like day 2, she looked at me, she's like, what are you? You're not, what are you? So I've always been in the ethnically ambiguous clan, and I like being around people of the same ilk, I have to say. Just it feels easier to live in intersectionality than in commitment, because it feels familiar. Yeah, that was a long, I don't know if I answered you.
No, that was great. Thank you, Nora. And just to, and this is actually a little bit for everybody. The term I heard you say just now, Nora, was that your activism is on stage. It's in the theater. And I think that's true for y'all. And I'm just, you know, I would love to hear, Hannah already talked about this a little bit, about how her concern and her desire to tell the Palestinian story has started to come out in her plays. If somebody else jump in, I want to hear, at what moment did you begin to think, I want to write or direct or produce work that actually speaks to what I come from, even though I may have grown up in the US or whatever? Anybody? I volunteer. Yes, Jamil. Yeah.
You know,
You're good. You're good.
Okay, good. You know, early on, it was precisely that question, that issue of representation and owning one's representation. And so when we started Silk Road Rising, originally Silk Road Theater Project, you know, the idea was to be writer-centric, that it would be about authorial voice, so a playwright-centric company, and that we would adhere to a rule that we call the playwright protagonist imperative, which is essentially that the playwright and the protagonist or central character share the same background, which was never to say that, you know, I can't write a play about Guatemala or Catherine can't write a play about Japan. We're just not interested in those plays. We're interested in the plays where the author is in conversation with heritage and community and family and background. And because playwrights, generally speaking, are full of angst of a certain sort, and I include myself in that grouping, you know, they're complicated relationships to heritage, but it is nevertheless the ability to tell one's own story. And we were very aware that peoples of Silk Road backgrounds, and really the stretch of the Silk Road, were constantly put in a react and respond mode. that, and in the case of Arab American and Middle Eastern American writers, it might be reacting to the latest news cycle. And somehow you have to respond, you have to contextualize, you have to explain, and then you have to proffer an apology of sorts, or some kind of, this act of distancing, or, well, I'm one of the good ones. So we didn't want that. We wanted, a forum where we could define and lead. And that is really the aesthetic that has informed our work, I believe, where we're giving people that space to define themselves on their own terms, and not to have to be playing defense all the time, or not, that this has to be a corrective measure of sorts. So I hope that does justice to your question, but that was the issue that propelled us getting into the work that we do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamil. And Lamis, thank you for telling the story of the origins of food and fadwa. And I'm so interested in what that moment was where we've talked about the food, and we get it. You're it. You should have your own cooking show. All right, I have spoken. But seriously, what was the moment where you said, the stories, I should say, that I want to tell are often connected, well, to being a woman, but to being a woman from a particular part of the world. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's similar to, both what Camille and Hannah said. I think I grew up in a family where my folks came here in the 70s from Palestine. My mom was 7 months pregnant, which is insane. Sort of leaving your tribe of family to come sort of be alone. And I think I watched them struggle with that aloneness, because family is such an intricate part of how you exist in a Middle Eastern culture. It defines you in all of these ways. I mean, there's negatives and positives, obviously. But the other thing that I saw growing up, and I think we didn't hear a lot growing up about Palestine either. It's almost like, let's not talk about the politics of things. You'll just get in trouble if you talk about the politics of things. Meanwhile, they'd be cursing at the news. So that's what you would pick up. You'd be like, why are they mad at Reagan? You just start, you know what I mean? I have these distinct memories of these sort of anger that they couldn't communicate anywhere. And when I got into my 20s, similar to what Hannah was saying, I started investigating. And in fact, I met this woman who was a journalist. She was from England. She lived in Texas. I went to school at the University of Texas. She was very passionate about the Palestinian cause. And she taught me more than my family did. So that I started to absorb things I didn't understand. And I sort of went back to my parents, and they were like, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. So that there's an internalization with, I think, this particular generation. My father's generation, my mother and my father have quite an age difference, but my father remembers leaving Palestine on a truck or I don't know. He remembers crossing the border into Lebanon, being a small child. He remembers being shot at. So there's a trauma there. And his younger brothers are more willing to talk about it than he is. And that silence affected me. So I felt like I had a responsibility. I mean, and I don't mean this in the way like, oh, I have to tell the story, but I felt like I have to write this in some way, or just bring voice to it. And it did, and I really take to what you're saying, Jamil, about like feeling like you have to explain, we are funny, we're good people, look at our food, so that I can get you into there's an occupation. This is what's happening. I remember in our early readings of the play, I literally had this white dude come up to me and go, I didn't know Palestinians were so funny. I'm like, really? I didn't, because they're some of the funniest people I know. which is the strange sort of, I mean, and again, the way the work has evolved over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I think people are taking different kinds of chances, less apologizing first, more, coming toward things. But I think that's where it came from, this real space of, these guys didn't get to tell their story. My parents' generation don't get to tell their story the way they want to. And in fact, it's not just that they didn't get to tell their story, they chose not to tell their story because it was too many reasons.
Right. Thank you. Hey, Perron, I just wanted to touch base about the writers that you are working with on this topic of revealing and illuminating stories from people's cultures of origin. And I see that you're working with Sanaz and, Nikki Masood. And come on. And I'm just wondering, how that work is developing and where you intersect with those writers in terms of telling their stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more sort of gratifying upsides of lockdown has been, getting to virtually, be in collaboration with so many incredible writers. And, Sanaz and I have so much parallel experience, both being Iranian American. And, when every play of hers that I read, I'm sobbing in recognition by the end every single time. And it's pretty remarkable to get to work with a playwright who so intimately understands the nuances of that lived experience in a way that's also subversive of like dominant cultural stereotypes about Iranians. And I just like what everyone has been saying about like being asked to sort of explain an entire country or an entire, the number of times I've been asked, like, what do you think about Iran? I'm like, what? Like, what do you want? I'm sorry. Am I the ambassador to the UN? Like, I don't know how to answer that question. But that she writes with such a sense of detail and specificity that, I'm sure like predominantly white audiences will respond to some of these plays with like, I didn't realize how funny you were, sort of like you were saying, Lamise. But that to us, it's just so true to our experiences, to our lives. And Nikki has written, I believe it's her first play in lockdown, which is this incredible, provocative examination of the Samson and Delilah story. And Ramiz's work, I think, sort of like explores such also humor and joy and buoyancy in ways that I know have been really disruptive to, like we one time got the note from a white artistic director that the play needed more edge. And it was just so very clearly about like how he was uncomfortable with the fact that the Middle Eastern men in the play never got angry. And I was like, well, of course they don't. They're clowns. It's a clown show. Like, it's, and so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that there's a way in which, there's so many television shows and some plays that have been widely produced that sort of treat tragedy as like a cultural characteristic, like that, or something that like, or it's like the sound of wind and bombs in the distance. And so it's like war is just part of the weather, as opposed to it being something like extraordinary that's happening for people who are also funny and eat really good food and love each other and have all of the complexities they have. And so I just feel
as though it's inevitable, as though there's really nothing else going on. It's just astonishing.
Yeah.
And it perpetuates the image of people from a particular part of the world that they're leaving that country and say trying to come to the US or a country in Europe just, to get a better paying job. You don't think they would prefer to be in Syria?
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, you know, how we also respond to those, you know, like we all stood with Paris, but like I didn't see everyone changing their Facebook profile for Aleppo, right? and um and I'm not diminishing what happened in Paris, but I do think that there's a sense of othering when the same things happen in the Middle East, because it's not a place that you had your honeymoon. It's not a place that you know, it's not where you went for your amazing 5-year anniversary trip. And so I want to work on the plays that interrogate that. And, you know, and that also demonstrate the fact that like war is not, or oppression or persecution are not like the DNA givens of being Middle Eastern. They are not the given circumstances of born of our genetics. And that much of it is the result of American meddling and you know, just whatever. Mossadegh. All I'll say is Mohammed Mossadegh. Okay, I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you, Piron. Thank you. Brilliant. You know what? I'm going to pause here and ask Carolina if there are any questions from attendees that the roundtable might address. Do we have anything, Carolina? Or Annie?
So far, no, but there have been some amazing comments that we can highlight on the top feed, but this conversation seems to be flowing so amazingly. So I'll give it back to you and continue the conversation.
Well, that's a great idea, Annie. I just saw in the chat that you've put, I wonder if there are any questions the panelists might want to ask each other. I think that's lovely. Anything you want to know that you don't already know about these other people? Wow, so you know everything, huh? Okay, Jamil.
So, Perron, you had said something earlier about global majority, and I really found myself attaching to that early on in Silk Road's history. I remember having a conversation with someone who's fairly active in what we might call a white theater company in Chicago, and she lauded our mission. She said, it's so fascinating that you're focusing on this really tiny little niche, you know. And I said to her, it's only 2/3 of the world's population. And that went totally over. She did not get it. But, you know, this idea of rejecting, I mean, I push back on the word minority. I don't like that word. It's such a loaded word. So I'm just sort of curious how you use, how you employ global majority in your work.
Yeah, it's I see in the comments that there's been some trouble hearing. Can y'all hear me okay? We're good? Okay, great. You know, it's been I feel like over time, my language has evolved, as also my sense of my own identity has evolved, as my sense of my responsibility has evolved. You know, I think everything, you know, sort of speaking to something Catherine asked earlier about like the awakening of activism in one's work, like I think it's all been sort of moving along this path together as I've also been reconciling like my own hyphenate identity and cultural compartmentalization and the ways in which I was complicit in my own whitewashing in order to like survive the world. And, you know, as like, it was not too long ago that I heard the term global majority in a training Nicole Brewer led, an incredible anti-racism training that I recommend any theater artist to take part in if they, you know, if you can. And when she framed it as global majority populations, I was like, oh, that is the most A, accurate, B, empowering term I've heard to encapsulate what it is I do and what it is I'm interested in telling stories that are of non-white populations, you know, and not in Middle Eastern, certainly, Manasa, yes, as well as, you know, having worked on and continuing to work on the stories of a number of other like Black and Brown communities. And so it's a relatively new way for me to think about it, in a way that I think, again, is centering, right? It's like centering the very communities that I wish to serve and the community that I'm part of, as opposed to minority, which is like the way a white person talks about me, right? And it's like, but it's not actually true. and I think it speaks to the fact that, like, you know, a theater can say like, well, we're serving our city, when demographically they rarely are, right? But also, like, the argument for greater inclusion and more radical inclusion across all levels of an organization, I think is do you want to be reflective of the world population, or do you want to be reflective of like the affluent suburb that attends your theater? You know, and I prefer the former. So that's where I'm at, which is no surprise, I'm sure.
Some differences or considerations in your approach to making theater when making for stages with primarily people of color or men audiences versus when you are making theater for more larger theaters with predominantly white audiences? Any thoughts? Hannah.
It's a really interesting question, and I think actually often it's one that is sort of forced upon you as a theatre maker, depending on who is putting on your play and who they perceive their audience to be. And I do find, I don't know if this is the same in the States, but definitely in the UK, there is a slightly patronising attitude sometimes from theatre companies who have very white and older audiences, this sort of attitude that they won't understand stuff, which I think is completely bogus and a way of kind of trying to shut things down and control them. And I was really interested in what Pirone was saying earlier about kind of Western theatrical structure and dramaturgy, and how that is just not helpful when you're coming at work in a slightly different way. I'm really interested in looking at, I know some of my colleagues here have been looking at different kind of forms of theatre as well, and I'm looking, or storytelling rather, looking at the other traditions. And so I think, you know, like for example, 1001 Nights and that wonderful, you know, that non 3-act structure. I'm so bored of 3-act structure being the benchmark of what is good and what is right in playwriting. I just, it makes me really mad. I talk about other things like theatricality and about kind of, you know, but I think a lot of the time that actually, of course, we have to think about our audience and we have to think about giving them a good time, but I don't think that we should be making something different for an audience that might be from the MENA region, or that might be a white audience or an American audience or a British audience or any other kind of audience. I think we want to make good theatre that is exciting and makes you lean in and be interested in the stories about these human beings. I think that's what's the most important thing, and about the things that unite us rather than that make us different. And I think it's about convincing theatres and people who run theatres that being allowed to tell those stories will not alienate your audiences. They'll bring in new audiences and make everyone, like, hopefully that brings people together in a really positive way. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I want to say that when I hear remarks along the lines of our audiences won't understand that, or it will alienate them, they're number one, selling their audiences short. That drives me crazy. But also, I want to point out that the theater leaders in this conversation, Golden Thread and Noor and Silk Road and now Jiva, are basically creating circumstances that give audiences an opportunity for context, okay? This just reminds me of years ago when I first started having plays translated that I would hope to see produced in the United States. I would hear, well, our audiences won't come to see plays in translation. And I would say, oh, really? You mean like Chekhov? Okay, somebody had their hand up, though. Who else had their hand up? Yeah, Lamise.
That's a good question. I think, you know, the other part of this that I find really interesting when we're making work to get out there is our community is not monolithic, as we know. And so they will have a lot of different reactions to something. And, you know, I think we think in terms of what is the most, and I don't even, you know, how do you even determine this? But what is the most honest way to tell this story about this particular family from this particular region, which is going to be different from their neighbors in the same region. So I think, you know, but I so appreciate the idea that we have a different kind of dramaturgy, and that's why it's so important that we have leaders from different backgrounds in the arts. And another place where this is a problem is in reviews. Our critics don't understand our work, and stuff gets couched politically in ways that you're like, what is happening? What did these people see last night? And which is so tragic, because we understand, especially in New York, how a bad or mediocre review can just destroy a production. So you also need Black and brown critics. You have to have that, because they're going to have a very different filtering system in terms of how they receive a work. And then you don't want to relegate them just to go see the brown and black plays. You want them to go out and also review the white plays, because they're also going to have a very particular kind of filter through which they're going to see that experience as well, or have that experience as well. So that's my 50 million cents.
Can I add something, Catherine? Would that be okay? I just like, you know, whenever the topic of alienation comes up, I go a little batty, because, you know, whenever someone says like, we don't want to alienate anyone, I always respond with like, you already have, you know, like you already did. Like, you just don't think about them and you don't prioritize them. But, you know, this idea of like, we don't want to alienate anyone is always at the expense of the communities that have felt the least welcomed in the theater, the least welcomed in predominantly white art institutions. And like the other thing that I often think about is this like obsession with understanding everything, that of all like somehow is suspended whenever someone wants to go to the Met and see an opera. I'm like, surely you are not fluent in Italian. Not all of you are anyway. And you're okay with like understanding the gist. You're okay with understanding like the sense of the moment, if not the literal word for word of the moment. And, you know, when I think about like what my mom went through when she came to the US, my father was already here for a medical residency. Then he went back to Iran. He met my mom. They got married, very quick courtship, came back to the United States. She didn't speak a word of English, and she learned English from like Oprah Winfrey and like magazines and Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, and didn't understand everything. And I think about, you know, our complete and total heartlessness towards immigrants, this idea that if somebody doesn't speak English, it's some sort of intellectual deficiency. And I think it would be pretty good for some white audiences to experience not understanding everything. And understanding that that doesn't mean they're stupid, but that just means that like someone is speaking a language they don't fully know. And maybe they should have to read between the lines and figure out the gist, the way my mom had to when she was trying to just like navigate a grocery store when I was a kid. So maybe I sound a little vengeful, but like what I actually want is for people to go through the same experience in a different way to expand their empathic imagination, and then hopefully leave the theater and go out into the world a little more tender and a little more patient to people whose lived experiences are different from theirs. And I also just want to add, I saw in the chat someone asked what Manasa is, and forgive me that I didn't explain. It's an acronym, Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian. So that's what Manasa is.
Beautiful.
Sorry.
Beautiful. I was just going to ask you to do that. Yes. And there's one last question in the chat, and it's from our friend Melis Acker. And here's the question. Do you guys see it? What are the ways we can collectively address the white colonizing monolithic assumption that there is a quota to how many people of color plays can be produced at any given theater or season? Maybe another way to phrase the question is, how can we break the mold of our meta-identity for branding purposes while retaining it honestly within our work? Oh, Melis, okay. Who wants to go for that? Okay, I'm not seeing everybody, but somebody? Yes, Jamil, yes.
We have to own the means of representation. The point that I had made earlier, I remember being on a panel some years ago in front of a group of almost 100 playwrights, and I was on stage with 5 other artistic directors, and one of them said, "So what is your advice to us?" And I answered, I said, "Stop giving us so much power. Stop centering, our particular aesthetics or likes or dislikes or interests or and this may not be the most popular thing to say, but there's some self-produce, or create the mechanism for getting your voice out there. I know it is easier said than done. I realize that it's really, really hard to start a theater company and to sustain a theater company. But I also really strongly believe that if you keep running into these, walls or this resistance or and you believe in your work, and of course you do because you're creating it, maybe go that extra step and mount the show or form a collective of sorts, or collaborate with people in similar situations, and perhaps that will launch your voice. I hope that will launch your voice and your art. And I know that can all be taken apart, but I do think that we should all think of ourselves as artists, entrepreneurs somehow, and that that the creative process and the producerial process, those processes are very interconnected.
I take it a step further and say that the curatorial and producerial process is a creative process.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that, I think, brings us to the end of our time. So I'm just going to tell you all how much I love you, how grateful I am that you came into conversation today. It means a great deal. I hope that if you haven't already done that, you will see This Is Who I Am. It is absolutely gorgeous. And that we can continue to support each other in all that we're doing. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Carolina and Annie, and everybody who came. And Malik, you're still here. I love you, dude. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Catherine, and to all our panelists. I'm sorry Carolina's been having some technical issues with the end of the stream. She is in Brooklyn, so snowy Brooklyn, whilst I'm in comparatively snowless Chicago. And I just wanted to thank you all again on behalf of Playco, and to all of our panelists and our audiences for joining us today for this roundtable discussion and your patience with our technical difficulties. We love embarking on this perpetual grand experiment with all of you. And I just wanted to sort of plug that as a small artist-focused theater company, Playco is committed to doing things like paying our artists for their labor, and trying to create a more equitable and social justice-focused theater community that we've spoken so much about today. Every dollar of support matters to us as a tiny company, and it directly contributes to our ability to do programming, events like this Idea Lab, content on the hub, which is where we'll be posting the transcription of this event for more accessibility, and our workshops for new play development, and of course, our main stage productions such as This Is Who I Am. And we would, love support of any amount through our website at playco.org if you are able to give this season. And we are so grateful for what we've been able to accomplish with the support of our community this year. I know it's just been the longest, hardest year for everyone. And it's events like this that make me feel really hopeful, and our company very hopeful for our future. So I just wanted to say, thanks, and ever thanks again. And if you have any questions, you can also email us at Playco, and continue talking in the chat. And we will see you next time. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you. All right. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.